Good morning to all of you from the North Cap University and welcome to the masterclass, the North Cap Masterclass, the series wherein you get to listen to eminent thinkers and leaders sharing their perspectives on what's going on in the world and why it should matter to you as future professionals. As I never tire of telling you, the magnet and the power of a great university is its people, that it attracts finest students and faculty. And over the past 25 years, the North Cap University has been just such a place. Our graduates are welcomed all over the world in leading companies and top university campuses abroad. And that's because of one reason. At NCU, we are interested in future. Just take a look at all the specializations we offer in engineering, management, and law, from artificial intelligence to analytics to data science to cybersecurity, augmented reality, virtual reality, to digital marketing, business analytics, and the latest trends in jurisprudence, law, and public policy. We cover it all. We take great pains to offer you degrees that will matter in future, and that makes us a top university. The same intent also drives our recent collaboration with Arizona State University, the leading American university. Our partnership is exclusively the first of its kind in India in terms of coverage, breadth, and depth, all designed to give you a degree that will work for you for the rest of your life. When we talk of pandemic, we think of COVID. But we have been in the middle of another pandemic, and it is perhaps more serious because it weakens the governance and good sense. I'm talking about fake news, manufactured propaganda, and high decibel shouting matches that you see on television, where the facts are twisted, obfuscated, or falsified. I'll cite two examples of how dangerous this can be. First example is from the civilian life. Remember the 2020 Shaheen Bagh protests and the Delhi riots in 2020? 53 people died, more than 200 injured. Why did that happen? Fact-finding reports from NGOs and commissions have established that the central trigger for the riot was the rapid spread of manufactured, malicious, and false news and videos. The second example is from the military field. Later in 2020, a war broke out between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia had superior military, superior arms and equipment, but they lost in just 6 weeks. Azeris used drones and information warfare against which the standing Armenian army had no answer. So clever use of information is both a problem and an opportunity, depending on who uses it and how it is used. And today you are going to hear from someone who has a deep understanding of how information warfare is played out and how it can affect you. Let me introduce our speaker of today, Mr. Pai. Nitin Pai is the co-founder and director of Takshashila Foundation, an independent center for research and education in public policy. His current research includes information warfare and high-tech geopolitics. He teaches ethical reasoning, international relations, and public policy at Takshashila's graduate programs, and his regular columns appear in Mint and The Print, the two publications. He has worked in various capacities in telecommunications industry, including satellite design and undersea cable projects. Before founding Takshashila, he spent a decade at the Singapore government as a policymaker in the telecommunications. He is a gold medalist from National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, an undergraduate scholar at Nanyang University at Singapore, and an alumnus of National College, Bangalore. He will speak on the topic India in the Information Age, State, Citizenship, and Governance. As always, you can write your questions and responses in the chat. Mr. Pai, welcome to the North Cap University. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Padalkar, for that very generous introduction. and to Zorawar for having me here. When he spoke to me and said, look, would you like to speak to this bunch of students that we have at North Cap? I asked him, what's the composition? He said, half of them are engineers, other half are divided between law and management. I said, great, I'm an engineer. Ultimately, all the things Professor Padalkar said, I think I identify most as being an electrical engineer. And one of the good things of being an electrical engineer is that I think it equips you for any kind of life challenge, profession that you want to take. I've been in and out of engineering, project management, government. And I think a good foundation in electrical engineering, which I got from NTU, Singapore, where I was not a great student. As an engineering student, I was a terrible engineering student. I spent most of my time in the computer room, hacking the system, or in the canteen, having conversations. Very little time in the classrooms. But I did learn engineering. And I think that has stood me in extremely good stead in the part of my career that is behind me. And I can see, even in day-to-day work that I do in public policy, a foundation in engineering has been extremely useful. So those of you who are, in engineering faculty or, in the same university where you have an engineering faculty, I would suggest that you go and get a good grasp of engineering, at least the foundations of engineering. You don't need to go and look at the 4th decimal place, but if you get a big idea of what engineering is about, an engineering set, and a good foundation in things like mathematics, statistics, understanding graphs and charts, it makes a wonderful life skill to have. Nobody can throw a graph at you or an equation at you and you get scared. You're not scared. As an electrical engineer, especially me having done communications engineering, I'm not scared of any kind of calculus or graph or equations or things that people throw at you, because we've seen them all. You know what it is, and you can't bluff an electrical engineer with graphs and charts and mumbo jumbo. So I'm really pleased to be talking to a bunch of people, many of who are in engineering and others are close to engineers. And although the topic which was mooted is, very grand, I deliberately made it grand sounding so that, people are impressed. But what I want to talk to you about, how does all of this make sense for you at this part of your life? Because you're in a very important stage of your life, entering, making the transition from school to university. And that's an important transition. As long as you were in school, you were under the tender loving care of your principal and your teachers and your parents. But when you're an undergrad or when you're in a university, the expectation is that you're an young adult and you will take care of your own study and education, your life, etc. Although the faculty and management is out there to support you and guide you, but the expectation is that you're on your own. In a way, the L board on your car comes off and now you're driving your own car. So that's where you are, and this is the early stage of your life. So I thought I'll give you something which takes some of the broader ideas that we all work on and makes it sort of relevant to the kind of life situation you're in. So let me just, because we're doing this online, I thought it's better to have some slides to just so that you can take notes. So I'll just pull those slides up. Basically, the idea is we're going to talk about India being the information age and what it means, for people like you. And why exactly should you even bother to spend this 1 hour with me and hear what I have to say, right? Because some of this seems to be so grand, state, citizen, governance seems to be all extremely high funda, right? So you don't really want to indulge in it. But I think it's important that you do. And if you bear with me for the next 30, 40 minutes or so, I'll take you through why I think this matters and why you should be paying attention to something like this. Okay, the first point I think we have to understand is that India is substantially an agrarian society. And what do I mean by this? Many of you would have known this whole idea that Indians lack punctuality. Your university is an exception. Some of us who are in really top class institutions, we are an exception, that we start on time, we end on time, we are very meticulous about punctuality. But by and large, you will find that people don't have a sense of arriving on time. And people make jokes about this, which I don't like. I don't like the idea that, to call Indian standard time a stretchable time and laugh at Indian standard time. I don't think it's a good idea to laugh at it. Indian standard time should mean standard time. It shouldn't mean anything else. So punctuality should be a virtue that all of us have. But if you ask the question, why is it that we turn up late? Why is it that our sense of time is not very serious? I asked this question and reflected on it. I realized that, look, if you are largely in an agrarian farming kind of a setup, let's say you're a farmer, okay, maybe 500 years ago, 200 years ago, 50 years ago, even now, let's say you're a farmer and you have to work with other farmers. What is the minimum amount of time, the least count of time that you need to worry about? Do all the farmers have to come exactly at 9 o'clock to do farming? I don't think so, right? I mean, my 1.5 generations ago, my family was in farming. So I know a little bit about farming. I spent a couple of days working as a farmer. So my own experience tells me that, look, I don't think a farmer needs to worry so much about every second, every minute, or every hour, right? Roughly 1 or 2 hours, half a day here and there is fine. So if you want to start work on a particular farming activity, you can start it today or tomorrow, 1 or 2 days. It doesn't matter exactly what time you start and whether people, all the farmers come together at the same time. There's some amount of leeway in a farming kind of a setup. But now imagine that you're in a factory, and those of you who have some experience in factories know that, in factories we'll have a siren. It sounds exactly at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. And exactly at 9 o'clock, people have to turn up, because if there's an assembly line, all people have to be in the factory at the same time, around the same assembly line at the same time, because they have to coordinate their work, right? So in an industry, it becomes all the more important for you to pay attention to time, because even 1 minute up and down can make a big difference. So then you see that missed the industrial revolution. Right? We didn't have factories in India. The first factory in India was created in 1860. Okay, that was a cotton mill. There was one. Most factories came into being in about 1890. So in 1890, maybe we had about 50 factories manufacturing cotton and some other things. Most of the heavy industries came into India in the 1920s and 30s and thereupon. So it's only about 50, 60, 70 years since we've actually had industrialization of any kind. Which means most society still lives in the pre-industrial agrarian mindset. Now you see, which city in India is famous for its punctuality? For a long time, it was Mumbai, right? Bombay. Why is that? Because Bombay was the city which had most amount of industrialization, right? And because of industrialization, they needed to have urban transport, they needed to have urban housing. Therefore, urban transport, they had trains used to run on time. So, all of that becomes an industrial society. So Bombay as a city, maybe some other cities like Madras, Bangalore, Calcutta, Delhi, to some extent, all of these became industrial. There was a greater idea of punctuality in these places. But most of the country, even today, has an agrarian mindset. Okay, now this is not a value judgment. It's not saying agrarian is bad, industrial is good, industrial is bad, agrarian is good. None of these things. This is just a statement of fact, which reflects in the way we do things. So when people don't turn up for a function on time, people don't turn up for an event on time, what is really happening is that there is no societal idea that punctuality is an important thing, right? Punctuality to the minute, to the second. Now, this is where our country is. Now, if you reflect on many other things in our society, you will come to the idea that, yes, this is a largely agrarian society. At least the mindset is agrarian. We might be doing industrial works, we might be working in an IT company, but the mindset of our society is still agrarian. And that has a lot of consequences. Okay. Which means that one idea here is that we didn't become an industrial society in any substantial way. Even to this day, the number of factories that employ large numbers of people is very small. I'll give you an instance of what we mean. Many years ago, I was talking to a business owner from China. This is about 2005 and 6. And I asked him, what does he do? He said he has a factory. He says it's a medium-sized factory. And I said, how many people do you employ? He said, we have 50,000 people. I said, wow, 50,000 people. He said, no, we have 50,000 people in 3 shifts, 24/7. So 8-hour shifts times 3, 150,000 people working in that one company. And he calls it a medium-sized company. Then I said, what do you mean by medium-sized? What about larger ones? He says, it's not uncommon to have 250,000 people per shift. So that's about 7.5 lakhs of employees in just one factory or one group of factories. That's what we mean by large. We have very, very few companies, factories of that scale in India, right? So when you have an industrial society with that kind of industrialization, you have a lot of other things which happen, right? In terms of housing, urban amenities, public transport, urban governance, a lot of these things come into being because you are in industrial society. And a lot of these things didn't happen in India, don't happen in India because we are not, right? And somewhere along the line, we also started embracing IT and so on. So we became a services economy. So we have one of the largest services economies in the world, which meant we skipped that entire industrial revolution part and jumped directly into the services economy, which is basically the information revolution, right? From 1970 onwards, roughly, after computers became mainstream, we are in something called the information revolution. We are in the information age. Now, what do we mean by an information age? The information age is basically an era in human society where information dominates societal relations, industries, politics, international relations, and the pattern of society, right? So today we are an information society because all of us have, everybody has something in the pocket which jingles, messages come, messages go. You look at, all of that. Now, what you have to now think about is we've taken this pre-industrial society, which is largely agrarian in its culture and processes and norms, and we've thrown it into the information age. Now, what are the consequences of this, right? Let's not spend too much time going into the theory of this. And I just want to leave this as a thought with you, for you to think about this. A lot of the challenges, the problems, the opportunities that we have in India today come from this simple fact that there's an agrarian society which has been thrown into an information revolution without entirely industrializing, right? We are trying to industrialize at the same time, but we are already in an information age. It's like a leapfrog into the future. The society has leapfrogged into something which is entirely different, and it has consequences. It has consequences in your personal life, in your community life, in your jobs, in your education, in your politics, everything, right? So I'll let you think about that. Let me not spend too much time on that part. But what you must observe, and this is something which I want to share with you before I jump in, is this governance gap in the country is widening. Now, what do we mean by a governance gap? Now, every society has, economy, people, science, education, which is at some particular level. And the governance of that is slightly below, right? Because governance will always take time to catch up. So there's always this gap. So this gap between where society and economy is and where the government and governance and administration is the governance gap. Every society has it. Whether it's the United States or whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's India, whether it's a state in India like Punjab, or whether it's a state in Karnataka or Maharashtra, all of these states, all of these entities, all of these societies have a governance gap. The particular challenge for us in India is that gap is widening, right? Ideally, you want that gap to be close, narrowing or non-existent. You want it to be zero, but it can never be zero. So you try to close the gap as much as you can, or at least keep it steady. That means as society and economy grows, your governance capacity also grows. But in India, unfortunately, that widening. So I live in Bangalore here, and in a 5 kilometer radius around me, just 5 kilometers around me, we have startups who are literally in the 22nd century. Okay, they are in the 22nd century. I'm not making this up. We have people working in space, aerospace materials. We are looking at people designing satellites, people who are looking at molecular biology, genetics. People are looking at artificial intelligence, quantum computing. All of that is happening in a 5 kilometer radius around me here in Bangalore. Okay. And in a 1 kilometer radius around me, all the old factories, big buildings have turned into co-working spaces. So people are doing information age jobs. People are working, doing startups. People are working as freelance people. A lot of things are happening here. But the state that rules and governs us all, the Republic of India, is a 20th century entity. Okay, which is 1950. That's about 70 years before now, right? It's 70 years old. And it itself is a post-colonial structure. The administrative apparatus is largely designed by the British to rule over their subjects. Although the Constitution of India is a document to govern free citizens, most of the laws and the regulations and the administrative structure, including the police, for example, are designed by the British government to keep the natives down. That is why policing in India is a British colonial policing. You have laws like sedition, for example. You have powers which the police have, which are unthinkable in liberal democracies outside. So Constitution is a 1950 document which is forward-looking. Most of the statutes, most of the frameworks are all British government. And not that's that. The administrative structure is from the 19th century. Okay, so most of the Telegraph Act is in the 1880s. The Indian Penal Code is, I think, 1860 or 1870. Right? So a lot of these, the civil service is still organized the way it was designed in 1880s and 90s. Right? So the police is the same. Right? So the administrative structure is more than 150 years old. Right? And now we are talking about people in parts of India who are in the 21st century. 22nd century. There are people in India who are in the 21st century. There are people in India who are in the 20th century. There are people in India who are in the 14th century. Right? So there are a lot of people in India who are in different centuries, but governed by a framework and a state which is pretty dated. And because very few of professional people take an interest in public policy, this governance gap keeps widening. So message for you is that you can't say that you're going to be in the 21st century and succeed in your careers without paying attention to the governance gap. So your role as a citizen is extremely important because you're going to be an educated, skilled citizen. If you're an engineer or a business graduate or a law graduate, you're going to be an educated person and it means something. And it's important for you, therefore, to engage in public life and try and close this governance gap. And that matters. I mean, whether you're an engineer or a non-engineer, it doesn't matter. This is something which all educated people have to do. And it's something we have to remember because in the middle of all of this information age stuff, we are still in a structure where 18th and 19th century and 20th century systems are used to govern us. So we've got to be able to manage with that and change that where it's necessary. So you must know this. And you'll see that a lot of our problems come from these two areas, that we are an agrarian society, in an information age. We are governed by a 19th and 20th century state, although parts of society are in the 22nd century. So definitely most of us are in the 21st century, right? So these are two backdrops. Now let's come to something more interesting. Now, before we go there, I just want to spend some time talking about why is it important for us to adapt to the information age, right? You could say, what's wrong? Why don't we remain an agrarian society? After all, there's nothing wrong with it. We can be happy in an agrarian society. There are a lot of things which are good in an agrarian society. But there are also great things in the information society. There are great things in an industrial society. So there are pros and cons of everything. So one argument can be made that why don't we stay where we are? Let's stay comfortably agrarian. There are two arguments against it. The first argument is that how an individual, community, or a country adapts to the age in which it finds itself in determines how successful it is. The United States and Britain, for example, were not successful and did not become successful and rich by staying as they are. They adapted to the industrial age. the moment they adapted quickly to the industrial age, both in terms of their society, their politics, their economy, because they adapted fast, they became very prosperous. So did Japan, so did Germany, and more recently, so did China. Right? So the moment they could adapt to the age they found themselves in, they became extremely prosperous, right? And extremely successful. So it stands to reason that you can't be successful and prosperous if you don't adapt. And what's worse, even if you don't adapt, there are other people who are adapting. So if you say, look, I don't want to take this opportunity, somebody else will take it. China will take it, or Japan will take it, or Malaysia will take it, right? So you have to adapt. So it's important for us to ensure that we make this transition to the information age just in order to be successful. And here it's very important to know that, size does not matter. In the industrial age, if you had a lot of land, a lot of labor, a lot of money, you could still succeed, right? Because China is successful because it had a lot of land, a lot of people, and money it could attract. So it could create those factories which I talked about, right? Millions of people. But in information age, size does not matter. You don't need 1 million people. One smart person or two smart persons can change a whole lot of things. So what makes it necessary is this human talent, capital. And not just human capital, but also how do we mobilize that human talent which is in society, make it effectively work for society as a whole. So this business of putting together individuals, adding together individual human capital is what the genius of a state is. And India is not very good at that, because we don't try to take the best of everything and try to assemble it. We don't have a way to assemble the best of the best and create the best, whether it's Olympics, whether it's cricket, whether it is, cricket has changed in recent years, but in general, we don't have an ethos or a system or a pattern where we can mobilize the best in society and make it work for us. And that's a big thing we have to solve. And governance, because of the governance gap, we've not been able to solve that also. Okay. So that is one thing which you have to keep in mind. The second reason why we have to make the transition out of an agrarian society is because an agrarian society, at least in the Indian context, is very, very iniquitous. The society is, there's a hierarchical, traditional Indian society. So there are, people on top, people at the bottom, etc. And this is a very ossified structure. There's a huge amount of social discrimination. So if you read Ambedkar, for example, Ambedkar was very clear. He didn't want an India of villages. Ambedkar wanted industrialization. And he's wanting to have industrialization is not merely because it was an economic thing. Because Ambedkar was among the few who had the experience of being in a social setting, in a rural setting, where the weight of oppression was on him and people like him. So he said, look, we've got to break this oppression. The only way we can break this oppression is we change the structure of society and we industrialize. So the need for capitalism or industrial society felt by Ambedkar is very much an accurate definition of what we need to do as a society. And now we have to go into the information age. It makes all the more sense to make that transition out of agrarian society to an information society. Okay, so now let's go to something even more interesting. Let's just focus on one issue. Okay, so we don't have enough time. I already said that this is a vast topic, but I don't want to go into theoretical things of giving gyan. I just want to try and relate this to you. Now, if I ask you a question and you can type the answers in your chat, either with your name or anonymously, what do you think is the biggest challenge that India as a country and each one of you as an individual face today? Let's wait for about 1 or 2 minutes for you to answer. What's just one issue? And it doesn't have to be relating to what I just said in the past 5 minutes. Obviously, it's connected, but I just want to hear from you. What do you think? Just type there. And I think each of you who's about 17 to 19 years of age definitely should have opinions on this. Don't feel shy. If your answer is wrong, the most that will happen is we'll laugh at you, right? That's okay. It's good to be laughed at. Everybody laughs at smart people before they realize that these people are actually smart. Go on. Let's see. We'll get a few answers. Yes, I have answers from Karthik Rohila, Kunal Jangid, Divyansh Agarwal, Pearl. Okay, some more. Let's get 2 more answers and then we move. Hitesh has an answer. Okay, we're waiting for one more person to jump in before we move on. Come on. Himanshi, unemployment and lack of skills, religion. Okay, thank you. You can keep typing the answers. I'll move forward. But here's the thing, according to me, and I'm so happy that many of you agreed with me when you said this, but I'm going to put this in very stark terms. The biggest challenge we have in India today for the last 10 years and for the next 20 to 30 years is this. How do we create 20 million jobs every year for the next 20 years? 20 million. 20 million. Just think of it. In crores, it is 2 crores. We need to create 2 crore jobs every year for the next 20 years. 2 crores is roughly the population of Australia. You need to create enough jobs to employ all of Australia every year. 20 million is roughly the size of number of people in Delhi, Mumbai, for example. So you need to create 1 Delhi and Mumbai worth of jobs every year. Just think of it. So that's your required run rate. The asking run rate is 20 million per year. What is your current run rate? It's 2 million per year. I hope you can see that right at the bottom, right? It's 2 million. Your current scoring rate is 2 million per year. So India as a society, India as an economy must create 20 million jobs, 10 times more than what's creating now. It has never, ever happened in history. China has probably done this. Other than China, nobody else has done it. India definitely has not done this. Why do we say 20 million jobs? Where does this number come from? Let me give you a sense of where this number comes from. Roughly from the time when you all were born, 2000, 2001, most of you, I suppose, are born around that time, 1999 to 2000, 2001. India was producing about 18 million babies every year. Okay, so that's about 18 million babies. Okay, so by now, about 18 million people are turning the age of 18 and 19. So you're among, the 18 million people who are born in your year. 18 million, okay, it's 1.8 crores. I'm an engineer, so I'm more comfortable with millions or 10 to the power of 3 and 10 to the power of 6 rather than crores and so on. So I'll use millions, but you can do the mental calculation. So you had about 18 million people who come of age every year. Assume that half of them want to work. Okay, not everybody of the 18 million wants to work, right? Half of them want to work for whatever reason. So you have about 9 million people, right, who need a job this year or next year or the year after. But how did this number become 20 then? Right? If it's only 9 million people who are turning 18 or turning 21, where is this 20 million coming from? Don't forget that there is a backlog. There are people who are born before you, who have turned 18 and who don't have jobs. If we've been creating jobs only at the rate of 2 million per year, that's a big number. Okay, actual scoring rate is much lower. I think it's about 1 million or less. Okay, I'm just giving 2 million because it's a big number. It is a generous number. Nobody will have any problems with that number. But actual scoring rate is much lower than that. Okay, it's 0.5 or 0.7 or 1. So for the past 10 to 15 years, we have a backlog of people who have graduated and who are not employed or not employed properly. They are also in the job market. So let's take about 6 million every year from there. And then don't forget that there are farmers. A lot of people in India are employed technically as farmers, but they're not really farmers. You don't need that many people in farming. From the year 1880, the British employed a set up a famine commission in the 1880s. Again, Ambedkar in 1920s, Nehru in the 30s and 40s, and many people since then. Professor Alag, for example, all these commissions have found that there are too many people working in rural areas on the same plot of land. So productivity of agriculture in India is very low because for that same plot of land, the same yield, you have much more people farming there because they're just available. They have nothing else to do. They have nowhere else to go. So they work in rural areas as farmers. So incomes are lower. So those of you who are familiar with this know that the rural income, a household in rural area, okay, a household is about 5 people. A household of 5 people on an average in rural India earns only about 10,000 rupees per month. Okay, 10,000 rupees per month. That is how low the productivity is because that same land is, 10 families are farming it. Maybe in the US, the same land farmed by a farmer in the US or UK, there are about 100 or 200 farming families doing it in India. So obviously that income is divided by 200 people. Income is low, the same amount of produce. So we need to get people out of farming so that farming incomes can rise. So if you see the farming crisis that you have today in India, where there are so many farmers protesting and all of that, it's not exactly a farming crisis, it's an industrial crisis. They are forced to be farmers because there are no employment opportunities outside farming for a lot of these people. So now you need to get these people into jobs. So take another 6 million from farming. So you have about 20 million people who need to be employed every year. 20 million, right? If we can create employment opportunities for 20 million people every year, most of India's problems will disappear. Whether it's an agrarian problem, whether it's urban governance, whether it's social security, whether it's environment, whether it's public transport, all the problems that you see today are actually manifestations of the fact that you don't have 20 million jobs per year, including economic growth, politics, religion, all of these things. I mean, these problems of religion, caste, communalism won't go away just like that. But the intensity of those problems will come down. Why is it that in the 90s we didn't have that much of communal strife as we have today? It's because very simply that there was a huge growth rate. Everybody was interested in improving themselves, getting a better job, getting better educated, going abroad, right? So once that engine starts slowing down, all of these older fights will start coming up to the front. So here we have a problem, right? We need to create 20 million jobs in the next 20 years in the information age. Now, this is your problem because you're going to be in this world where if that number of jobs are created, you're going to be fighting for those jobs. Now, what does all this mean for you? Right now, that is exactly what I want to tackle in the last 10 minutes before we go into Q&A. Is this in a world like this? Obviously, this world you can't change the world, right? You have to operate in this world. So what do you need to do to succeed in this world? First thing is you need different skills and mindsets. Okay, everything that your families and your teachers taught you in school, the way to behave, etc. I'm sorry, I might be offending some faculty in the university as well. I'm sorry, that doesn't work. You cannot be a idle, person who says, okay, you teach me, I'll listen. Yes, sir, 3 bags full. You can't be asking for instructions and doing what you're told. Whether it's your parents who tell you things or your seniors, elders in your community, whether it's your professors, you have to question. You have to build the ability to question it and justify those answers using reason. In an agrarian society, you could still survive by not questioning. In an information society, you can't. Especially people like you, if you want to succeed, you have to be able to question it, question everything, challenge everything, make up your own mind. Don't wait for people to tell you what to do. Don't look at society as a hierarchical structure. There are people above you that you have to do, sir, and people below you, you have to kick down, right? That's a very hierarchical agrarian mindset. What you want to do is you want to build an egalitarian world. Treat people as equals. Learn how to operate in a equal, in a world where everybody is equal, where people are networked. There are no hierarchies. Hierarchies are going to be a problem. Anybody who thinks hierarchical is going to lose. People who think networks are going to win. So you have to get that mindset first. The most important thing. Once you get that mindset, rest becomes easy. Okay. And it's very hard for us to do because for the last 15 to 20 years of our lives, we've been told to behave in a certain way. We've been told to toe the line. Been told not to question our elders, be respectful. Yes, we have to be respectful of our elders. Respect is a grace thing. It does, I mean, questioning everybody doesn't mean being rude and insolent. Respect for a person's experience, status, and wisdom is different from unquestioning acceptance of whatever they say. You know, so it is possible that you can be extremely respectful and gracious in society as an individual, at the same time, extremely questioning and open-minded when it comes to issues, knowledge, learning, etc. Okay, so that's the first thing. But back in the information economy, I think the biggest thing what you'll have to learn in the next few years when you're in the university is learn what can you create. For every YouTube channel out there are thousands of followers. On Twitter, there are thousands of followers. On Instagram, there are thousands of followers. All followers are customers. They don't create value. They are the value which other people are exploiting. So if you have a YouTube channel with 25,000 people who are following you, the 25,000 people are what you use to get money, maybe to sell advertisements, to do whatever, right? Get promotional, do promos, etc. as a YouTuber, right? If one of the 25,000, you don't get anything. You have to pay money to buy whatever is being advertised. So basically, value will be created by people who can create. You will have to learn to create things. What can you create? Can you create a YouTube video? Can you create a YouTube channel? Can you create a company? Can you create a technology? Can you create a company? Can you do a startup? Can you draw? Can you design? Can you make things? Can you make things with your hand? Can you create a car? Can you create an electric car? Can you create a drone? Can you learn how to fly a plane? Can you learn how to operate industrial, be a manager? Can you learn how to govern a city? So if you can create, you will derive value. You will be on top of the food chain. If you can't create and you're only a consumer, you're at the bottom of the food chain. And unfortunately, as the lower and lower you go in the food chain, the less and less money you will be having. The ability to earn is lower. How are you going to earn your money? Because the person on the top is going to earn all the money, and you will have to be, you're a worst situation is to be a consumer without money. You can see all these things which you can buy, which you can watch, which you can consume, but you have no money to buy it. How do you earn money? To earn money in an information economy, you must be able to create. So you must learn how to create. That's the thing which you want to learn in North Cap University in the next few years. Second is, how big can you think? I get very upset when I see engineering students in India creating yet another low-cost bicycle. Another favorite thing which people do is, I'll create a low-cost coconut plucking machine, or I'll create a low-cost electric vehicle. Why are you all thinking low-cost? Thinking low-cost doesn't necessarily give a great product. Did Google think of creating a low-cost email system? Did YouTube think of creating a low-cost video channel? No. But they're low-cost. They're zero cost. Right? So what did they think? They said, how big can we think? Can we go for the globe? Can we think of the world as our market? Not India, not Ludhiana, not Delhi, not Bangalore, right? We still have a problem today. Even in Bangalore, I think Bangalore is fairly advanced in terms of global thinking, probably better than most other parts of the country. But even in Bangalore, people are thinking local. How do I give home delivery of food to a person in Bangalore? Think of the world. How do you deliver home delivery of food to the world? People who can think big will achieve big. People who think small will be again at the bottom of the food chain, right? The third point I want to leave you with is, what must you learn in university that allows you to keep on learning, right? So learning is going to be an ongoing process. It's our parents' generation. My parents' generation was probably the last one where you could say, okay, I studied everything at college. I don't need to study anything more. My generation and your generation definitely is lifelong learning. Every day you have to learn. So if you have to have a lifelong learning, the university is a place for you to learn how to learn. right? So you're not just learning engineering, law, or management. You're learning how to learn. Once you learn how to learn, you can learn anything, right? So you can be an engineer, but 5 years later, you can become then you can become a banker, you can become a public policy analyst, you could become a politician, you could become a teacher, whatever you want. You can become a .com, whatever, a startup founder. So you must learn how to learn, right? And that's a meta thing, and only you can do it for yourself. Nobody else can, help you with this. There are no textbooks which will teach you how to learn what to learn, right? You have to learn this yourself, and that's a skill which you have to pick up in university. Number 4 is, what are the personal qualities that you must develop? How do you deal with other people? Are you a polite, civilized person, yet forceful? I mean, it's not an argument for being, weak or whatever, but can you be civilized? Can you have a sophisticated way of dealing with people? Can you treat people as equals? Can you treat people with respect, especially people who might be doing work for you, who might consider themselves at a lower rung of society as compared to you? Do you know how to be respectful to people who help you, to your teachers, to the people who clean your room? Do you know how to clean your room? Do you know how to be respectful but not obsequious to people who are more powerful than you? So these are the things which you will have to learn. And again, this is important because you're not in that agrarian society anymore. The agrarian society, we knew what are the norms. We knew how to conduct ourselves. But in the information society, those things don't work as well. So you have to change. Of course, you have to retain what is good, but there are a lot of things which you have to change. And the last point, and I leave you with this, is what is your moral compass? What do you use to determine what is right and what is wrong? A lot of us who are in technology, business, management, and economics very often go through our life without reflecting on what is right and what is wrong. How do you know what is right and what is wrong? Just because someone told you this, your great-great-grandfather told you something, so is that right? Is it written in some holy book somewhere? So does it make it right? Is it written in a law somewhere? Does it make it right? How do you determine this? So you have to start thinking about it and make your life decisions now. How do you determine what is right and what is wrong? And how is it that, how will it help you, guide you in your work forward? It might be very weird to think of ethical reasoning or morals as part of, undergraduate education, but it's extremely important, right? And if I have to go back into my college days again and see what would I would study philosophy, I would study ethics, because that ultimately makes a huge difference to the way you live your life. So finally, last slide and I'm done. What is the recipe for this? I have given you a lot of challenges. How do we organize ourselves as a country to meet these challenges? It's very simple. The values in the Constitution of India offer the best way to deal with these challenges. It's a great document. It's come out of a lot of compromise and decision by really, really elite and enlightened people who've thought much broadly for generations. And although many people look at it as some kind of a civic syllabus or a holy book, it's really a user manual for your day-to-day living. I really urge you to understand it well. You don't have to read it and like a lawyer. I mean, I'm not asking you to read and understand this clause and that article and this bullet point, etc. Right? You just read it and understand the spirit. Understand what are your rights. What do those rights mean? What are the values in it? What is the relationship between you and your state and the government? And that is extremely important. And that will give us really, as a society, the way to mobilize and extract the best out of our society for the information age. Thank you. So we'll take some questions and ready.
Thank you very much. That was very, very insightful. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Let me lead off with a question from your last point about moral compass, because that resonates very well with a lot of us here. My question is, when you are surrounded by people who are fundamentally negative, and where you see unethical behavior as rewarding, how does an ethically grounded person make a difference in today's life? What does he or she have to do?
Yeah, thank you. I think thank you very much for the question. I think you've asked the most deepest question possible in this. I look at it this way, and I'll put it in context. Most of us in this setting, engineers, lawyers, management people, business leaders, are in the business of making things. We make things, we solve problems, we create things. These could be physical things, these could be software, these could be systems, these could be laws, these could be rules, companies. Every act of creation has an ethical dimension. You could say, for example, in the industrial age, that I'm creating a knife. I'm creating a knife or a sword. And the sword has no morality of its own. Right? A knife which I create can be used to peel vegetables. It can be used to kill people. It can be used to prepare food. It can be used to do harm to people. But the knife itself did not have much of a morality. So what made it moral was how you used it. So if a person used it for bad things, it was used badly. If people used it for good things, it was used for a good thing. So in that sense, technology did not have any kind of polarity. But in the information age, many of the tools that are not, neutral like that. They have certain characteristics which favor certain people or favor certain types of applications. For example, if you build a surveillance system, the surveillance system does not benefit both the citizen and let's say the state the same way. It gives more power to the state as compared to the citizen. If you build an app which collects personal information, some people get more information and the others don't. So there is an inherent morality, especially so in the information age. And it's very important for us to therefore understand what are the consequences of the things that we do. And we must develop a sophisticated understanding. So a moral person, I would say, is a person who's conscious of the consequences, has thought through of the consequences of one's action or one's creation before the act of creation itself. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to get it right all the time. You might have judged that there'll be good consequences, but unfortunately there were bad ones. Well, that's fine. Everybody makes mistakes. You're not so much about getting it right all the time, but consciously thinking about the impact you have on society, on the environment, on the people around you, on the citizenship that you have with the state, on what it means for the world, what it means for the next generation, what it means for the previous generation. So when you have this 360 degrees view of what your actions mean for society at large, I think you are doing a moral thing. So that's the simplest way to look at it. Don't much about whether I'm following the principles which have been told to me by my ancient rishis or by my guru or by my holy book or by my constitution. These are all, they can all help you guide. They're like lighthouses. There are different lighthouses at different wavelengths. You might not necessarily have to follow any or all of them. But what you need to do is basically be able to navigate properly, given the situation you're in.
Thank you. We have had some interesting questions from students. Maybe we can take them.
Okay, so do you want me to take Chitra's question? I think Chitra has asked about, we are mostly clouded by a lot of confusion regarding things, too many options, what to do, etc. How do you do that? I know that's a wonderful situation of life, Chitra. When you're 17 or 18 or 21, I think you should just look at yourself as a person who's capable of anything. You can be an astronaut tomorrow. You can be an electrical engineer. You could be a world leader. You could be a startup founder. You could be a farmer. You could do whatever you want in your life. And I think that's a wonderful situation to be in. So what you think is a clouded situation is actually a great point to be in. And that's the point where you start looking for clarity. So don't look at it in a troubled way. It's something which all of us have to undergo when we are at that age. but use that opportunity to think through. For example, I gave you some hints on what questions you should be asking yourself. And try to define yourself as broadly as possible. It's too early to say that I'm going to be an electrical engineer. I'm going to be a lawyer, right? I think you could just say that I'm going to use the next few years to be an educated person who has some expertise in certain areas like engineering, law, etc. But I'm an educated person. I can take on any kind of challenges which come to me in the years ahead. So that's, I think, a good way to look at your situation. So don't be too anxious, don't be too perturbed. Shaurya asked, what hardships do you have to deal with you in your profession? Well, Shaurya, I can give you a single answer or I can tell you a long story for the next 4 hours. But just look at it this way. Take it as it comes. Don't worry about it, at least at this point in time. Don't burden yourself with all of those things. At this point, there are some things within our control, some things which are not in our control. So things within your control, try to do the best that you can, prepare the best that you can. So you're in a university setting, you have to do, you have to get good grades, you have to learn stuff, do the best that you can. And when the next hurdle comes, you take it as it comes. So don't worry about what comes, what my life is different from yours will be different from somebody else's. So yeah, all of us go through, so there are 2 ways you could read all of this and get extremely worried. Oh my God, there are 1,000 different types of hardships and 50,000 ways of solving it and lose heart. The other way is just say, okay, I'm just driving in the traffic. I can just see the vehicle in front of me. I just need to ensure that I don't bang into that vehicle. Right? If it slows down, I slow down. If it stops, I stop. If it moves, I move. That's the best way you can deal with it.
Kunal has a question on the Q&A box. What if ethics and morals are against each other? He asked.
Very good question, Kunal. You should come and join the Takshashila Ethical Reasoning course. You are the kind of person who should be taking our course. Yes, there are times when morals, as you define it, which you have received in a particular way, and ethics will be in conflict. One good place to read this is the Gita, right? If you look at the Bhagavad Gita, that is all what it is about, because dharma or your ethics or your duties or your morals and ethics are often in conflict, and you'll have to resolve this. So the Gita, if you look at the message of the Gita, that's what it is. Ultimately, it's a pattern. It basically tells you, look, these things are going to be in conflict, and you have to decide what is more important, prioritize what is more important, and act accordingly. And who decides what is the right priority? You yourself, right? So that's what he says. So the short answer there, and that has remained through history, is that you reflect on that situation which you encounter. You reflect, you discuss this, you educate yourself on what are the various pros and cons of various things, learn from your own experience, and arrive at your own decision. Ultimately, that's what it means. You reflect, you educate yourself, and then you decide based on discourse and other things. So there are patterns, there are frameworks you can use to resolve these dilemmas. And we teach some of them in our ethical reasoning program. So you can probably Google it and find some of it. But short answer, think about it, reflect on it. Reflection is a very, very important faculty which human beings have. And the whole part of education and learning in day-to-day life sort of destroys the ability to reflect. So you just have to step back, maybe, every few hours a day, maybe once a day, reflect and learn how to reflect. The more you are able to reflect, the more you will be able to solve all these questions. Easy, it's pretty easy and cool. It's not something you need to have a long beard and you have to go in the Himalayas to meditate to learn this. You can just do this sitting in your chair, in your canteen or your school bus or somewhere and do this. It's not, just don't do this when you're driving.
We have a minute left, so maybe we can take one more question before we close.
There's one question about, I want to be an entrepreneur, but when to give time to it to get my dream come true? Well, I've been an entrepreneur before, a couple of times. And I would suggest that you try this after you finish your graduation. Because use your time in the university to get a solid foundation and become an educated person. You can always be an entrepreneur. There's no last date to become entrepreneur. You can start your entrepreneurship at 60. There are people I know who start their journey at 60. But there's a last date for undergrad, right? So you can't be an undergrad when you're 60. I mean, it's possible, but not very nice, right? So try to get a good education when you're in university. Make sure that you're well educated, that protects you, creates a base, economic base for you, gives you a safety net. And then you can try this when you're 21. 21 is not too late for anything.
So that brings us to the 11 o'clock mark. On behalf of North Cap University, I must thank you, Vijay, for spending an hour with us and giving us a lot of insights. I have been taking notes. It's about 2.5 pages long. So I hope our students also have similar takeaways. Thank you very much. When this pandemic is over, we hope to host you in person at the campus, talking to our students.
Thank you, Professor Padalkar. Really an honor and a pleasure to be with fellow engineering and, of course, management and law students as well. But I somehow see this being in the company of engineering students as really a particular pleasure.